We constantly guess what the future will look like, but we rarely ask how it will be funded. Let's run the numbers. Today we trace the economics of a world where physical scarcity fades. The premise is simple. Production costs for most physical goods approach zero. Energy is abundant. Manufacturing is automated. Distribution is nearly frictionless. Under those conditions, what happens next? Most conversations about post-scarcity stop at abundance. They celebrate the end of want, the collapse of price, and the liberation from labor. But an economist would ask a different question entirely. That question is not what becomes free, it is what becomes expensive. Because in every system economists have ever studied, eliminating one scarcity does not remove scarcity, it relocates it. So here is the economic mystery we are solving today. If physical goods lose their scarcity value, what takes their place as the binding constraint on the entire system? Follow the incentive structure. The answer is not a new material. It is not a new technology. It is the one resource that cannot be manufactured, stockpiled, or automated. Human attention. To understand why, start with the economics of information. As early as 1971, the economist Herbert Simon articulated a principle that still holds. A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. Simon's insight was structural. He argued that information consumes the attention of its recipients, and therefore an abundance of information requires efficient allocation of that attention among the sources competing for it. Notice the economic logic. Simon did not say attention is valuable because it feels important. He said attention requires allocation because it is finite and consumed by every competing information source. That was the condition in 1971. Now extend it forward. In a post-scarcity physical economy, information does not merely grow, it becomes the dominant output of an automated production system. Every automated factory, every generative system, every algorithmic optimizer produces not just goods, but a flood of choices, offers, signals, and claims on your finite time. The supply side explodes, the demand side does not. Interestingly, this creates a paradox. The more abundant the physical economy becomes, the more intensely every actor must compete for the one thing that remains fixed, a waking human day. So let us define the terms. Post-scarcity, in this scenario, means the marginal cost of producing most physical goods converges towards zero. Energy is cheap. Raw material processing is automated. Under this assumption, the traditional problem of producing enough dissolves, but the allocation problem does not. Instead of allocating scarce goods among competing uses, the system must allocate scarce attention among competing producers. This is the critical distinction. Scarcity does not vanish, it migrates. And in an information-rich, goods-abundant world, the migration leads directly to the bottleneck that Herbert Simon identified decades ago. Now, what makes attention economically distinct from physical goods? 3 properties. It cannot be manufactured. You cannot build a factory that produces more hours of human focus. The supply is biologically fixed. It cannot be stockpiled. Attention not used in a given moment is lost. There is no warehouse for unused focus, no savings account for yesterday's concentration. It is perishable in the strictest economic sense, and it cannot be delegated without losing its value. You can automate the production of a car. You cannot automate a person choosing to care about something. That choice is the scarce input. So under this scenario, attention satisfies all 3 classical conditions of an economic resource. It is scarce relative to demand. It has competing uses. And its allocation determines who captures value in the system. This is not a prediction. It is a conditional scenario. If physical production costs approach zero, then scarcity migrates. And it migrates to the fixed bandwidth of human cognition. Here is the constraint. Once attention becomes the binding resource, every institution in the economy must reorganize around capturing and retaining it. The incentive structure of the entire system pivots. Consider how pricing works. A product is valuable partly because it is costly to produce. Remove that cost, and the product becomes trivially available. What remains valuable is the moment someone engages with it. That engagement becomes the currency. Davenport and Beck extended this logic in 2001, arguing that attention functions as a scarce economic asset that can be measured, traded, and monetized. Their framework treated attention as the new currency of business, not as a metaphor, but as a functional description. In an information-saturated market, the entity that captures sustained attention captures economic power. Now extend that into our scenario. If physical goods are essentially free, then the only meaningful competition left is the competition for human engagement. Producers do not compete on price, they compete on relevance. Relevance, in economic terms, means matching a product or service to the precise attentional window in which a person is willing to allocate their finite cognitive resource. The matching problem becomes the core economic problem. And this is where incentive structures diverge. In a scarcity of goods economy, the incentive is to produce more efficiently. In a scarcity of attention economy, the incentive is to capture attention more effectively. That shift changes who wins. In a goods economy, competitive advantage comes from production scale, supply chains, and cost reduction. In an attention economy, competitive advantage comes from psychological salience, design, and timing. So the institutions that thrive are not necessarily those making the best product. They are those solving the demand-side allocation problem, matching what they offer to the attention windows that remain open. Now, Heitmeyer's 2024 analysis takes this further with the concept of calcified attention. On digital platforms, accumulated engagement such as followers and views functions as a stored form of attention. Under this framework, calcified attention can be exchanged for economic value, political influence, and social power. It behaves analytically as a symbolic currency, not money, but a convertible resource with exchange properties. This is important for our scenario because it means attention is not only consumed in the moment, it can accumulate, solidify, and become a durable economic asset. The dynamics shift from flow to stock. And when attention becomes a stock, it creates new forms of inequality. Those who accumulate calcified attention early gain compounding advantages, exactly the way capital accumulation works in a traditional economy. So the post-scarcity economy does not eliminate winners and losers, it relocates the competition. The winners are those who capture and retain the most sustained engagement over time. Under this assumption, the entire value chain reorganizes. Production becomes a commodity. Distribution becomes trivial. But curation, the act of selecting what deserves attention, becomes the highest value economic function. Now here is where we test the assumption. The thesis depends on production costs reaching near zero. But there are reasons to doubt that arise uniformly. Energy may be cheap, but not free. If production costs fall substantially but not to zero, the goods economy and the attention economy coexist. Scarcity splits rather than migrates, and the equilibrium becomes harder to predict. There is also a distributional problem. Even if attention becomes the dominant resource, the mechanisms for allocating it could concentrate power. Platforms controlling attention flow could become more powerful than traditional monopolies. A rational exception also exists. Not all economic activity depends on individual attention. Infrastructure, automated maintenance, and machine-to-machine coordination could form a substantial layer of economic activity that operates entirely outside the attention economy. That said, the consumer-facing layer, where value is ultimately realized, still depends on human engagement. The attention bottleneck may not dominate every sector, but it would dominate every sector that serves people directly. We can observe an early version of this dynamic on existing digital platforms, where accumulated engagement converts into money, influence, and power. Heitmeyer's framework calls this a universal symbolic currency within the platform ecosystem. But this comes with a limitation. Platform-specific dynamics may not generalize to the entire economy. What works analytically within social media does not automatically describe the behavior of housing, healthcare, or infrastructure markets. So let us return to the opening question. What happens when money no longer matters? Under the assumptions we have built, the economy does not stop functioning. It reorganizes around a different bottleneck. That bottleneck is human attention. It satisfies every condition of economic scarcity. It cannot be manufactured, it cannot be stored, it cannot be automated, and every actor in the system must compete for it. The incentive structures follow directly. Producers shift from optimizing production efficiency to optimizing relevance. Institutions shift from managing supply chains to managing engagement pipelines. Value migrates from the factory to the curator. New inequalities emerge not from who owns the means of production, but from who commands the allocation of attention. Accumulated engagement, what the framework calls calcified attention, becomes the durable asset that compounds over time. But the conditional matters. This outcome depends on production costs approaching zero across enough sectors. If they do not, the goods economy and attention economy share the stage. The question is not whether attention matters economically. Simon established that in the 70s. The question is whether the physical economy shrinks enough for attention to become the dominant constraint rather than a secondary one. The realist framing of post-scarcity life is not a world without economics. It is a world where economics pivots. The resource being allocated changes, and that rewires incentives from the bottom up. The funding model decides what survives. In a goods economy, capital funds production. In an attention economy, engagement funds relevance. The scarce resource defines the survival mechanism, and the survival mechanism defines the system. Change the assumption, change the equilibrium. To understand a post-scarcity world, do not ask what becomes free. Ask what becomes expensive. Follow the scarcity, and you find the economy that runs the system. So here is a framework for testing any post-scarcity scenario. First, identify the binding scarcity. What resource cannot be manufactured, stored, or delegated? That sets the price. Second, trace the incentive structure. Who competes for that scarce resource, and what strategies do they adopt? The strategies reveal whether the system produces broadly distributed value or concentrated advantage. Third, test the assumption. Ask what must be true for the scenario to hold, and what would change for it to fail. A fragile assumption means a fragile scenario. Fourth, identify the distributional consequences. Who benefits and who does not? Concentrating attention-derived power in a few platforms may solve one inequality while creating another. Finally, separate the technology question from the economics question. A technology can exist without being economically sustainable, and an economic model can function without its assumed technology arriving. Under this assumption, the attention economy is not a prediction. It is a conditional analysis of what could happen if the physical production constraint relaxes enough. The conditional makes it testable. The question worth carrying forward is not whether money becomes irrelevant. It is which forms of scarcity define the next allocation system, and who designs those incentive structures. It comes down to scarcity. When physical scarcity fades, something else takes its place. The economic logic does not change. Only the scarce input does. Every economy runs on whatever cannot be manufactured. Find the scarcity and you find the system. The future is just incentives at scale. See you tomorrow.